And assuming that goes well, we'll also discuss media capture issues with an editor's draft to follow. So current status of WebRTC PC, at least as of this morning, we had 100 open issues with only 3 blocking advancement to CR, and that's our main focus today. Once those issues are resolved, we will go to CR. So a reminder about TPAC. Hopefully you've all registered. I believe the discount period or whatever is up, but in any case, if you want to go, you need to get in your travel reservations and registration ASAP. We have put out a draft agenda, and we're looking for feedback on it so we can make the best use of the time. And if, in particular, if you're looking to present, please let us know. So a little bit about this virtual meeting. We have put up links to the slides, I think, on the mailing list and on the wiki. We do need a scribe. Do we have a volunteer? It doesn't have to be detailed. We just have to be clear about what decisions we make. Is there a volunteer for scribe? Deafening silence. Adam, can you?
Adam did it last time. I can do it if no one else agrees.
Okay. Okay, we are recording the meeting, right? I guess.
I will only scribe the decisions made.
I think that's all we need. Okay, thank you. Okay, for discussion today. We have 3 CR blocking issues, and Taylor and Stefan will go over those. And then we have a non-blocking WebRTC PC issue, which Taylor will talk about, relating to the priority API. And then we have some media capture issues, which various people will talk about. Okay, so on to the CR blocking WebRTC PC issues. And I will turn it over to Taylor.
But assuming you're on the first slide.
Yeah, we're on issue 1178-1406.
Yeah. All right, so this is basically the PRs are just, representing decisions that were made at previous virtual interims that ICE and DTLS transport objects are not recreated when you have an ICE restart or new DTLS association. And then PR 1623 specifies when exactly the objects end up created as a result of set local description and when they end up being set on different senders receivers as a result of bundle negotiation, which would happen either on a PR answer or an answer. And the next couple slides show some excerpts from the PRs. So I'm not sure if there's that much more to say. There weren't really any new complexities that I encountered when writing the PRs. So is everyone okay with merging these, or what's shown? Again, I'm just trying to get into the mean still.
Taylor, it's Colin here. Just a question about them. In the reoffer case, you create, if you have a DTLS session, it's all up and going, and you do a new offer that creates a new TLS session, can you still receive media on your old TLS session while that's happening or not? I mean, or is that clear? Is it clear? I guess is mostly my question in how you wrote it up.
So I would think that would be
that you applied set local or just did create offer?
Well, I'm not sure I really care what the answer is as long as the answer is clear. I mean, I guess, either way, Bernard.
I think this is something that would be defined by the DTLS SDP spec. Because this is a protocol level question.
I worry that what that spec says is that you can continue to receive audio on that TLS association after you would do the set local. But that I worry that what browsers are going to implement is that you can't, that as soon as you form a new TLS session, the old one is destroyed. And look, I'm not upset about either one of those situations. What I'm worried about is that we have a weird contradiction or something.
Well, yeah, I agree the behavior should be that you can continue receiving media because the new DTLS association uses a new generation of ICE candidates. So, the previous selected candidate pair, is going to be used exclusively for the old DTLS association. If packets continue to be received on it, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be decoded. But as far as whether this is, explicitly called out by the relevant RFC, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Well, if that's how you think the browsers are going to work, then I think it's all fine. We don't have to say anything about it here. I was just thinking if we're going to do the opposite of that, then we needed.
Yeah, I think the only weird thing, Cullen, would be if you had two DTLS associations trying to operate over the same ICE transport.
Which we've determined we're not going to allow, right? I mean,
yeah, if we don't allow that, I think you're okay.
Yeah. Okay. Then sounds good.
So why don't you just take a look at this PR, just make sure.
Yeah, so the previous slide was basically the entire contents of the other PR, which is, again, clarifying that the objects, the scope of the objects and whether or not they get recreated. And the second slide is only showing half of the PR, sort of, but the other half is just the set remote description part. This is the set local description part, where the objects are only created as a result of set local description, just like how ICE gathering only starts when you set local description. But saying the remote description may still finish bundle negotiations, so that may change the sender transport mappings. I didn't include the full PR here, but I thought this is probably enough to get the picture. All right, so no objections?
Okay.
All right, I'd say let's move on then.
Okay, Stefan.
Yes. Well, first, did we decide that we merge PRs 1623 and 1631?
I didn't hear objections to doing that.
I haven't read them, but I certainly don't object to merging them. So it sounds good. Whatever.
Okay. And we then close these two open issues.
After we merge it.
11 and 1406.
Yeah.
Okay, I put that decision into the chat now. And then we are at the next slide, right, Bernard?
Yes.
Yeah. So this one is about the text we have in the WebRTC spec on centering, scaling, and cropping. And first of all, it's in conflict with what Jacob says, and I think Justin and Cullen and many others have pointed this out. And then I started to look a bit more carefully on what we actually say in the WebRTC PC section, and I am highlighting here, we talk about the desired video, desired size, and destination size. And desired and destination is sort of is undefined here. And my first guess would be that desired size would be the size of a video element on the receiving side that is used to render a video. But the sender will not know about that video element size because that's not signaled using SDP or JSEP. The sender only knows about what it can send, of course, how big or small images, and what the receiver can receive. And the latter is known by the image attribute, SDP attribute. Next slide. However, this desired size and destination side could also mean the max size that could be sent, and that's what is in the example in the WebRTC PC text. But I think that could lead to unintended effects. I mean, I have here an example. If you have a 1920 by 1080 video, 69 aspect ratio, and the maximum size that can be sent is 1440 by 1080, and the video element on the receiving end also have a 16 by 9 resolution, but smaller in size. Then you would actually throw away, if you follow the current WebRTC example, 240 pixel columns on each side. That would be perfectly usable. While JSEP, if you do what is a should requirement there, you would scale it down to 1440 by 810, then encode and send, and then scale as is defined in the HTML spec before rendering, and lose no data. So next slide.
Just before you go on there,
Yep.
That's a great example. I think it really makes sense. The only thing that I might comment on it is that it's sort of weird that the receiver set their image attributes to a 4:3 aspect ratio when they're going to render it in a 16:9 window. Like,
yeah, but
that thing happens here, but that may be the application's fault, is where I'm going with this.
No. Good that you brought this up, because the way I understand JSEP, this 1440 by 1080, that's what the image attribute says, and that's what the decoder at the receiving end, the maximum size it can decode.
If that's a maximum size,
yeah,
or a maximum suggested size, that might not match what it's actually being displayed in. It may be being displayed in the thumbnail. Who knows?
Yeah.
Also, what it's being displayed in is not necessarily a static thing. That's something that can change second by second, depending on reflows and the resizes of windows and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. But this, what I'm meaning with 1440 by 1080, that's what the receiver can decode or receive, and that's signaled by the image attribute. And
okay, but it's not forcing that aspect ratio, right?
No, it's not forcing that. Right. That's
that's just its maximum size.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I get your example. Good.
So next slide. Well, JSEP says, as I already said, that the sender should apply downscaling instead. And the downscaling must not change the track aspect ratio. And my PR 1570 proposes that we remove the WebRTC PC text on center scale and crop and replace it by referencing JSEP. And I also added a note that you can have effects of this. I mean, if there is an aspect ratio between the track and the video element. And you can move on.
So, I mean, this is, I don't think this really works, right? Like, what if it works in the example you gave here, but if the image adder had sent you a size that effectively one way or another fixed the aspect ratio, right? So if your camera was 16:9 and the image adder and the receiver said the aspect ratio must be 4:3, then what do we do here? Because we have to change the aspect ratio at this point. We can't just take the JSUP must not change the aspect ratio.
Okay, but I thought we were sort of referencing JSEP, and that's what we had to abide to.
I think JSUP is talking about what happens on in what's happening with the codec and the encoder and how it's changing the video stream. But right now we're talking a little bit about how the video, what a slightly separate issue is how the video from the media track gets mapped into the transcoder. What the transcoder does is controlled by JSUP, and it may or may not scale things. But you know, if we have an image adder that says 4:3 and we've got a 16:9 camera, something's got to happen.
Yeah, and then I would say that's up to the constraints. I mean, if you have no constraints applied to that track, the browser could scale it to fit. But if you have set mandatory constraints on the track,
okay, but I think the WebRTC spec, I agree with the constraints thing, that makes sense, but I think the WebRTC spec needs to explain that that's how that happens, and not that the aspect ratio never changes.
I thought when this case was brought up before, the conclusion was nothing gets sent and you shouldn't have used that image adder. I may be remembering wrong though.
No, I think you're right. I mean, nothing gets sent if you have set mandatory constraints that stops the browser from rescaling the video before sending it. But
right.
If you on the track.
Right. But if you haven't set those constraints, it can rescale it. I mean, I think that's the important thing, and we just need to stay that somewhere.
Yeah, I thought that was sort of part of the media main spec. There it says, I mean, pretty clear that the browser is allowed to give the track the width and height it is allowed to within the constraints.
Well, yeah.
Sorry.
I don't think that really. It says like it just gives you the best track you can. So let's say I put no constraints on my camera and I get a media track. Okay. When I get a media track, it doesn't know I'm sending it to it. I'm going to even use it for WebRTC. It might think I'm going to do something else with it, right? Mm-hmm. So it gives me the full resolution of the camera. That's what it's going to give me. And now when I pass that to WebRTC, it needs to be something needs to happen.
Yeah.
Without that text, would we end up with browser defined whether we have square or non-square pixels, or whether it crops or letterboxes, those kind of things, or is that covered elsewhere? If we don't remove this, or if we remove this text, is it still covered? What should happen in that case?
I think the part about non-square pixels and so on, is covered very well in JSEP.
Well, again, if you had a camera with non-square pixels, I mean, basically JSEP says the pixels have to be square when you send them over the video, right? But if you had, it doesn't say WebRTC will not work with cameras that don't have square pixels. I mean, right?
This is saying that that's a local problem?
Well, saying that we can't put in this text that says you can't change any of this, because the browser needs to be able to take the incoming camera screen, and if it's not constrained, be able to adapt it in a way that fits whatever constraints it has, and then makes it, be appropriate for whatever needs to be sent. And JSEP doesn't cover that. JSEP says, you will not do anything like that at the later stages. But in what gets fed into the video thing, we need to say something.
I actually don't think we need to say something here. I think it's an implementation and a local problem.
Yeah, but the text we're writing here is not saying the browsers can do whatever they want. It's saying they can't do anything, and that's not going to work. We have to write some text. If you think the answer is that we write the text is the browsers can do whatever they want, we can do that. That is the original text that was in here 6 months ago or longer, and Martin objected to that. And that's how we got down this whole path. And maybe we just go back to that. I'm not objecting to that. I'm saying that we can't just say you do what JSUP says. That doesn't cover it here.
I mean, if we look at what we have now, most of what you're talking about, Callan, is not described now either. I think.
No, it is. It says it's the center scale crop, right? It says here's how you take what we have right now, and I understand why Justin and people don't want to plan changing it, but because it loses data, right? But what the text we have in the draft right now says, you take whatever you got from the media stream, and here's what you know what you need for the image stream, and the way you get from A to B is center scale crop. And what JSA and what we can't say there, what won't work there is saying you can scale, but you may not crop and you may not change aspect ratio, right? That won't work. That's my objection.
I think the current text is very unclear because, as I said early on, it talks about the desired size, for example, but nowhere is that.
We have to clearly. You're right. We need to clear up what desired means because desired was written long ago when we thought we might propagate all the thing back. But desired here definitely means the limitations set by the image adder. Right. I mean, that's just a terminology thing.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so
I mean, I think that where Justin would go with this is, I mean, on all of these things, you really have two choices. You can either, crop and lose data near the edges, or you can allow black to be inserted to get the aspect ratios to match. And Justin made a very strong argument to Ecker and I found it very compelling that particularly for the screen sharing case, cropping data was the wrong thing to do. And what we should do is insert black if that was needed, not crop.
I think, I mean, the JSEP spec regarding the image attribute is written clearly saying it should only signal a maximum and a minimum width and height. And then you could sort of send any aspect ratio. So you wouldn't really need to have to send black pixels, either borders or top down.
Well, you have to be a little careful if they set maximum and minimum to the same value.
Yeah, of course. You can do that, but it encourages implementations to only have one max and one mean and not being the same value. So.
Yeah. Justin's argument about don't throw away data, especially for screen sharing, is a strong one. And perhaps you can approach this by saying, this is what we do before we feed the data to JSEP. And JSEP says don't change anything. But doesn't mean we can't we couldn't specify that we add black in order to make things work before it gets fed to JSEP.
Right. So I would describe that as we should change the text here to be scaled in pad. Instead of center scale crop, we should be scaled in pad.
Slide interjection or whatever. I think one of the cases that might influence this a little bit is on a cell phone. You often have a hardware decoder that might have a fixed aspect ratio. So if you are constrained to not cropping, including not letting the user prefer to crop or not, you're going to end up with wasted pixels if you try to send 4.3 to something that can only decode 16.9.
True.
Where does that take us regarding Callan's proposal?
So it seems to me that what we're saying is that from JSTEP, you're going to have information about what is possible to send.
Right.
And what we're saying is that if we're able to fit the current video within those constraints, that's good. If not, we can letterbox or letterbox or pillar it.
Right, and I think what Justin was arguing for was, and we will not ever crop. We won't crop.
But there are use cases where cropping is absolutely the right thing to do. So I don't know, should this be flip a bit, whether you want cropping or letterboxing? Because you're going to have to do either if you want to make use of the full decoder surface.
If the decoder doesn't, if the image actor interpretation constrains you to something that you can't do without it. We've been over this a few times, and it's completely normal when opening a camera to open it in a mode that actually crops and pixels off the sensor. So
I certainly have no objection to we have a setting that is local. It's not negotiated with the other side or anything, but just a local setting that says, you know, whether you center scale crop or whether you scale pad. That would be fine with me. I'm guessing that would be fine with Justin too, because an application that was doing screen sharing would choose the one that was appropriate for that application. I mean, it would certainly be an easy way. That seems like to me an easy way to resolve this.
that was suggested back in Boston. I think it was Justin who suggested it then. Yes.
We certainly can punt it to the application. This will mean that the application will have to set this on all these screen sharing cases, and we'll have to define what the default is. Or
so if there's some kind of, so this kind of ties into what I'll bring up later, but if it's done similar to the frame rate thingy, or frame rate, let's see, reduced frame rate or downscale in RTP Center, there could be like a balanced mode, which is essentially if you're doing tab capture or screencasting, you can have this be do not crop whatsoever by default. And then for the UVC case, you can default to it's probably a webcam, and then say I probably don't care about the edges as much. And then you can override that with guiding behavior. If you're a big fan of cropping screencasts, you can do that.
Okay, I guess anyway, 1570 we can't merge. And
but let's see if we can have I mean, are people okay with this proposal that effectively we have two modes, center scale crop and scale pad, and the application gets to choose between them?
Where does the control live, Cullen? Just to be clear.
No idea. That's a great question. I think it needs to live somewhere not on the media capture spec, but in the WebRTC spec.
I would assume the sender or maybe transceiver. Probably the sender. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a sender because we need it when FTP is gone.
And do we need two or do we need three with the balanced type thing?
I think it makes sense to have three, like Peter Bostrom was saying about the default being different depending on the thing we'll talk about later with content hint.
Well, what's the third, though?
So the thing
third is
is
default.
scale, crop, or let's see, letterbox, crop, or do whatever the browser thinks is best.
Right.
Because
okay, I get what you mean.
So basically, letterbox, crop, or unset, which I guess is balanced. No, or default. Whatever.
Balance kind of implies that half doing each, what we're talking about.
Yeah, balance that's not the right word. Okay, but maybe letterbox, crop, or default.
Yeah, do the best.
Maybe auto is a better term than default.
Sure.
It's choosing between
Auto,
one or the other
yes.
based on something it knows. Yeah. Okay. I like that. Did we get that?
We should be using the values the values from the HTML spec though, just because they're predefined.
Harald, could you repeat? You were sort of cut.
And we should be using the values from the HTML spec because they're predefined.
Yeah.
People know what they mean.
Does it have those three values?
It has, if I remember rightly, it has letterbox, pillar, and stretch, and some fourth value that I don't remember. We can easily say that we could.
Okay, but I don't think what we're doing is any of those. Like my recollection of that was they were roughly what you just said, but I don't think that's not what I'm proposing.
Stretch is also at odds with we can't set non-square pixels, right?
Yeah.
Now stretch would be stretch could be handled like resizing, but we do that all the time. But we're perfectly fine with saying don't use only those two values. But I think that inventing new names for something that's almost just about exactly the same thing is going to cause endless confusion.
No, look, I'm not saying that our value should be pillar or letterbox because we don't know whether that's going to happen. I'm saying it's scaled and pad, and the padding might be letterboxing or it might be pillaring, depending on which way it needs to be padded. So,
I agree. Basically, Harold, letter and pillar boxing are the same for us. And we don't know which is going to happen, but they both fall into the same category. So this is actually quite different from the explicit control you would use in HTML.
I agree.
I'm having a hard time actually finding what they are in HTML too. I'm not sure my memory is correct.
So I don't know that there is an HTML property, but there is the CSS property object fit, which I see the link to on IRC.
Oh,
which has contain, which I guess would be letterbox, cover or fill.
So are we all agreed that we're going to add a new knob and we're just deciding what the names of the knobs are, or are we still unsure about whether we're going to add the knob?
I think there might be some confusion as to what the knob does, given some of the suggestions for what we can name it.
So
yeah, and I'm not clear on where the knob sits either. Is it?
Okay, so let me make a concrete proposal trying to bring this in the name of getting done then. These ones look excellent. It looks like the two modes we were discussing in CSS would be called fill and contain. And so I'm proposing we add a new knob, which I think Harold said needs to be on the sender object, and it can have 3 values: fill, contain, and auto. And fill corresponds to what we used to have of center scale crop, and contain corresponds to effectively scale and pad.
And the last one was?
Auto is, it picks either fill or contain based on knowledge the browser has about where the stream's coming from and what it thinks might be best.
Yeah, I think that would be a perfectly good thing to have as missing value too.
I agree with putting it on the sender and the names that you came up with and the meanings. Those sound good to me.
Yep, sounds good. Agreed.
Can we get that in the minutes before someone changes their mind?
I'm trying my best, so you have to review it.
And it's the object attribute from CSS that we want to emulate.
Right. Yeah, I think it might be cover rather than fill that we want. If it's center and crop, that seems to be what.
Oh, sorry, I just read the wrong one. You're right. Thank you, Dom.
Yeah, I was curious whether we can, assuming we can make this into concrete text, whether we can agree that we'll go with that without having to go through another VI cycle to approve this.
And we want the scale down text since we don't want to increase the size.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And we also need to deal with, as Stefan pointed out, the desired needs to be defined to to be clear, it's what you learned from SDP, not anything to do with the size of the video element on the far end.
Exactly, and it's actually the intersection between the image attribute and the sender capabilities somehow.
Perfect. That sounds like the right definition.
I mean, I guess I can put some time on this, but I would need help. Would you work with me on this, Cullen, or is someone else volunteering?
怎么还没有做完？好。
I'm not sure you heard me there, Stefan, but yes, I'm glad to help you on this. That's perfect.
Thanks. I still haven't given up about transitioning to CR before TPAC.
I will work with you on it soon.
So, I mean, maybe one way to make sure we can do that is to figure out who wants to be on the critical path of merging that PR. So obviously Stefan and Cullen, but others chimed up. So,
are you asking for who volunteers to review it?
Well, or who really wants to review this before we go to CR with it merged.
Right,
And
who might object without being able to review it?
Thank you.
I think Justin should probably review it.
Okay, so I guess there is agreement that if we get a PR that Cullen, Stefan, and Justin agree on, and we merge it, we can go to PR with that.
Or CR at least.
Sorry. Too many acronyms.
Well, yeah, actually, if everyone agrees on it, we probably should go to PR.
Okay.
So have you got all that down, Stefan?
I hope so. I've written a lot in the chat.
Okay, so
will you guys ping me when that's done, so I can make a release of it?
Sure.
Perfect.
All right, so we are now to the non-CR blocking part of the meeting, and we have Taylor with issue 1625.
So basically, we were going to implement the RTC priority type enum, which is a parameter of RTP encoding parameters and refers to the RTC web transport spec, and realized that it has some potential issues. First of all, this is something that controls the SCTP level priority and also the QoS priority, but from the RTC web transport spec, it also controls the relative transmission capacity that different encodings get, where each successive priority level uses twice the transmission capacity of the level below it. So like the example given is audio is low and video is high, and in the same time that 1,000 bytes are sent for audio, 4,000 bytes are sent for video. But basically, I don't see how this could be useful at all, because those ratios of 1 to 2 are not nearly granular enough for any kind of advanced application. And, you know, the example of audio to video using a ratio of 1 to 4 is not very realistic. Like, more realistically, it'd be something closer to 1 to 40. And, you know, if you're using the full 1 to 8 range just for audio relative to video, then you can't have any video encodings that are, you know, greater relative to each other. And also, it's a problem that it mixes up this relative bitrate with QoS priority, because I would say it's a pretty common case that you'd want something that's using fewer bits to actually have a higher priority in network queues. In that example of audio versus video, you would likely want audio have a higher QoS priority, or I guess they use different categories as well, but even for separate video streams like screen sharing and camera, you may want one to use less bits but still have a higher QoS priority. So basically my proposal is to not use the priority enum to control the relative bit rate, but instead add a new field for this, which would allow ratios of more than just 1 to 2, 4, 8. And I have a PR that suggests one way we could do this with the text pasted below.
Taylor, speaking as the author of that particular text, which was written in a desperate attempt to get at least something that was concrete enough to implement. If you want to send something at high priority at a low bit rate, the meaning of the text was just set it to high priority and send it. Because then all the bits that it needs will go out. And then when you run out of bits to send, the rest of the bit rate will fill up. But if you need to start dropping packets, those high priority things will not be dropped.
So you're saying that
the reason for the 1248 was that people also thought that starving the lower layer flows lower priority flows completely was a bad thing.
But say in the example where you have a thumbnail, maybe you want the thumbnail to be sent at all costs, but you might not want the thumbnail to max out its bit rate. You might be fine sending the thumbnail at 50K so long as it arrives on the other end, whereas you might want your main feed to take all of the available bit rate before, but still not being as high priority as all of the thumbnails is an imaginable case, right?
Yeah. If you set the max bitrate to 50K on all the thumbnails and high priority, you will get exactly that.
But you might not want 50 to be the max. You might want 50, but start use more than 50 as soon as you can. So, or like while there's nothing else using that bitrate. So you'd have a thumbnail that goes from 50 to 500, and then you want it to stay 50 until there's basically free bit rate, but you always want it to be high priority.
And if this ratio is only tied to the max bit rate, what happens if there are two things with high priority that have different max bit rates? Then the rest of the things, which bit rate do they lock onto for the ratios?
I think we're getting distracted. The point here is when congestion occurs, how do you allocate the available bit rate between different encodings?
Right. And if we have this ratio that we're locked onto, it's not clear how even locked onto.
What do you mean?
We're saying that the priority is orthogonal to the allocation rates.
I think that's a good approach to take. I'm just saying Harold is suggesting that it's not, and that the locking on of the ratios is tied to a max bit rate, so that as long as the high priority thing, if there are more bits available than what the high priority thing needs for its max bit rate, then basically you can go off of the
I guess I'm saying prioritize ugly video, but don't cap it to being ugly video. Is the case that doesn't work for high priority.
I agree.
Whatever Harold's saying.
Yeah, that case doesn't work. I do
So
think
that's why decoupling that would make sense.
So if you do simulcast and send, you can actually achieve it. But the purpose of the priority was to get something that was implementable and actually understandable. I'm not married to it.
I'm not sure this is.
Is it not implementable if you have these things being separate? Are you arguing that it's impossible to set QoS different?
No, if anything is possible given enough knobs.
I mean, basically, we already have a spec that says this field controls the relative transmission capacity and the QoS priority. I'm just saying we separate that into two things and allow more ratios than just 1, 2, 4, 8. So, like, there may be existing problems with this, but my proposal here is just splitting it up and making it a bit more flexible.
Yeah, it's the splitting up that I'm worried about, because then you get into complex scenarios where you can start handing out foot guns.
I didn't catch that last part.
I get the idea of trying to separate these. Okay, that sort of makes sense. But the thing is, I'm not sure that relative bit rates is ever what you want. It's almost always sort of like, give this guy this much and then move on to giving other people that much. Which I think lines up the way Harold was thinking about it better than a relative bit rate.
So you can imagine a case where, for example, I'm streaming both a camera and a screen share stream, and if I don't have a lot of bits, I want both of them to be low quality, and if I do have bits, I want both of them to be high quality and sort of scale at the same time, but at different rates.
Yeah, but
seems like a pretty reasonable.
Yes. Just let's say there's no congestion whatsoever. I mean, can anyone on this call even guess what the relative bandwidths of a screen share versus a HD video stream is?
We're not talking about when there's no congestion, though.
No, but we are once we talk about sort of trying to. I mean, how should I allocate them? If I want reasonable quality of both, are they one to one?
This is defined as when congestion occurs. I mean, when congestion doesn't occur, then they'd be limited by the max bit rate or some, implementation-specific limit.
Yeah, but I mean, what I'm saying is, it's usually from a thinking about how to set bit rates is very difficult for developers. But thinking about relative importance is a little bit easier. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't be two orthogonal things. I'm just saying that relative bit rate may be a very difficult knob for developers to work with.
Are you saying? Sorry, go ahead.
Colin, you're saying we shouldn't have relative bit rate, but we already have relative bit rate with the way the spec is written right now. That's what the 1, 2, 4, 8 thing is.
Right. Yeah,
so if we don't want relative bit rate, then we should drop that part of the spec.
Colin, are you saying something more like, I want to send this in QVGA, if I have more available bit rates, and first increase this stream to VGA, then that other stream to VGA, and then, like, do you want something more like in order of what things should happen instead of available bit rate? Like, send this in 5 FPS at first, and then if you can, go up to 15 FPS? Or do you mean to have no order of which things should happen?
I guess when I go and talk to developers about how to set their clock sense and bit rates, and this is something I get asked about a lot, right? Like, I tried to set all these, nothing worked, and not so much in the WebRTC context. They almost always describe it as, for my application, audio is most important, followed by screen shares, followed by the video of the person. Or, video is critical to me, followed by audio, followed by, 50 thumbnails. And they generally want the bandwidth allocated to what they think is important to them until it's pretty good, whatever that means. And then they want bandwidth applied everywhere else. And then once everything's pretty good, then they'll move the things that are important to them to excellent. Now, I'm not saying maybe provide any easy way for people to implement what I just described, but I mean, that's sort of what what many developers wish they could get without thinking about it if we could give it to them.
Then maybe the conclusion is that we need a way to set the minimum bit rate as well for each encoding. So this level you're talking about where things are good enough and you should move on to the next highest priority encoding.
Yeah.
We can define it such that, like, if you can't meet all the min bit rates, then you'll try to meet the min bit rates at the highest priority encodings first. Then once you're meeting all the mins, then you scale them according to this ratio.
Right. So relative bit rates plus a min target type thing. I don't know. It might just be too complicated. I'm just sort of the discussion I just break down is how we got to originally. We decided, well, we'll just have these priorities. We'll just have a few priorities that people choose from, important, not important, to do with bit rate, never to do with clocks. And then people were like, yeah, but don't starve the bottom ones, and that's how Harold added the 1, 2, 4, 8 as sort of rough approximations. And look, it's a rough and ugly approximation. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just
maybe the bottom ones should be a min bit rate. Then
I think there's two problems. One is that the QoS, the DSCP markings, basically, the DSCP markings and the bit rates are coupled in these things. Right. And so one part of this is, should we decouple those? The other part is the ratio is 1, 2, 4, 8. Is that what we want versus being allowed to be more flexible? So I think these are two separate things.
And it should probably be approached as such regardless.
So, and then sort of a separate topic of, with these things, is it enough for these kind of use cases we're describing? So really doing something else as well.
I'm very much in favor of decoupling them because I don't see why DSCP markings and bit rates should be tied together. But I'm a little scared of the can of worms of meeting all the use cases.
Priority network dependencies.
Right, because this
but I think what Taylor said kind of makes sense in terms of having a min when this stream is usable bit rate and try to fill those.
Yeah, because there's no point in, trying to send 3 simulcast encodings if they're all going to be terrible. We want to focus on the lowest priority one first. And it would be great if you could do this without having to, pull get stats and disable and enable encodings all the time.
Right. So look, I agree with separating them. I agree that probably this relative ratio, particularly of 1, 2, 4, 8, is probably not what we want. I just sort of, I'm not sure that relative bit rate is exactly the knob that we want to give people to try and deal with the bit rate issue.
All right, let's maybe move on and discuss this more in the PR.
Okay.
Anyone opposed to that?
Okay, so we're going to move on to the media capture portion. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to turn that over to Peter. Are you here?
Don't we have an hour and a half?
Oh, sorry. No, we have 5 minutes. Sorry. Anyway, Peter Bostrom.
Wait, sorry. Do I have 5 minutes or do I have the... All right.
You have whatever time you need.
This is going to be the same thing anyway. So my name is Peter Bostrom. I used to work on the WebRTC video implementation about a year ago, and we ran into an issue where our assumptions made inside the browser didn't match the reality that we were facing. So some background for this. This doesn't only apply to video, but if I found video aligned, it's because of that background with video. But either way, like we were saying before, browsers make assumptions based on how content gets ingested. So if you have UVC, which is a USB video class device, Chrome will think that it's a webcam. If you have tab or desktop capture, Chrome will think that it's screen share. Well, it is screen share, but it will also assume that it's having like a web page style of detailed content or slides, etc., and not that you're screen sharing a video game. And as far as I can tell, all of WebRTC assumes that all audio is speech. And this is wrong if you have capture cards, so you're really doing desktop capture, but Chrome can't see that. It's the wrong behavior when you're screen sharing video or game content otherwise, and it's wrong for music for a couple of reasons. And one of those is that if you're sending music and you have noise suppression by default, it will basically cut out snares and whatever it can. So what I'm suggesting is that provide some way to override this browser default behavior so that if you're screen sharing but you care more about motion than you do with individual frame detail, you can say this is like motion style content. And if your webcam is really a capture card, you can say I prefer details for this stream. And for audio, you could override and say this is music, or maybe something that, you know, this is already pre-mixed content. You don't need to do any processing on it. That would be kind of the rough gist of what I'm getting at. And the idea with putting this on the media stream track instead of the RDP sender is something that I think can be discussed a little bit separately to whether we want it or not. But the idea with putting it on the media stream track is that you put it in one position, and then all specs that make use of it, or all browsers can make use of this content hint in whatever they want, which means that you don't have to rewrite the media stream recorder APIs to be able to use this. You can just infer it, and then whenever your spec is in conflict with a content hint, the spec wins. So if you explicitly override some behavior that's not tied to that's not appropriate for the content hint, then the specific override still wins. So in the previous example where we have, if this would be applicable to cropping, then maybe your screencast would default to not cropping, but if you explicitly say crop, that would take precedence. Does that make sense, kind of?
Yeah, that's a good explanation of the issue. The argument for putting it on the RTP sender would be that there are certain things that occur where you may lose this information, like passing audio through web audio and so on, or you'd have to put in a bunch of text elsewhere to say that this state is somehow preserved if you pass through web audio and generate a new track on the new stream on the output.
So can you just put on the output track then?
You could. So this is where you could also allow this content hint to be like implementation defined as good. So if you don't set it on the output, the browser could best effort try to preserve it internally if it cares. Or you could say, please set it on the output track if you want to be sure that it's actually propagated. So I think one of the points for having this kind of content hint instead of adding a bunch of knobs on RTP sender as well, and I think that's good to bring up, is that this kind of ties into more implementation defined things like what quantization to use, etc. And I think quantization levels is something that we should really not expose to web developers, because like even on the WebRTC team here, I think most people don't have a good notion of what QP means. So sending this out to the open web would probably make it a very misunderstood parameter that people kind of copy off of Stack Overflow rather than understanding it. So, but they can probably easily say, I want to prefer motion in my content, or I want to prefer details.
Right, but that same interface with that same way of specifying it could exist on the sender as well as on the track. You can say, I want motion, I want detail.
So correct. I think there are two kind of discussions in here. One is, do we think a content hint that does not actually define specific behavior makes sense? And then where to put it. Does it make sense to put it on the track, or does it make sense to put it on all sender configuration objects? And kind of in that context, remember that RTP sender is not the only object that consumes these.
I'm generally in favor of the concept, and the only question is whether it's on whether we put it on the sinks or whether we put it on the
source.
Right.
So I mean, I'm in favor of this. We've discussed this before. It came up very long ago, right? We had whether something was music or speech was something we could specify, and whether it was preferred spatial or temporal resolution, I think was the term we previously used. Don't we have those on the sink right now, not the source? So in the degradation preference and stuff? Or?
So in the RTP sender object, there's the something preference that has k-balanced, or k prefer frame rate, or k prefer resolution, or whatever.
Yep.
But this can do things like turn on content sharing tools and stuff like that in the codec. So it's a little bit different than just frame rate versus resolution.
It's also tying into the QP. So there are more things that we don't want to expose knobs for that this would control, and it would still influence what k-balanced does.
I guess what I'm just going towards all of the examples that you bring up though have to do about codecs effectively. So it seems that these controls should exist where the codec.
Well, the problem is the codec specific. In the codec, right? It's very codec specific. Like some codecs have good screen content tools and some don't.
Bernard, I'm 100% on board with we should just tell it what our intention is, like this is screen content or whatever, and the codec may or may not support that. Like abstracting this away from like, set parameter 22 in the codec, right, for sure. Right. I'm totally on board. But it seems like why wouldn't this be controlled at an abstract desire level at the place where the codec is, or the echo canceller, or the media processing is happening?
And that would generally point at the sinks.
Right.
But I was muted, I think, but I have a comment. A lot of these controls are already on the media track constraint set. I mean, you have echo cancellation, gain control, frame rate.
One of the problems with that is that you always, as a developer, then have to play catch up, and so because you can't kind of infer what your defaults are, like anything that we add to a future web spec, a user or a web developer would have to be in the loop of, and the implementations would kind of deteriorate because we'll add defaults that are good for speech but wrong for music. So if you can't say it's music, stop messing up my stuff, then we will keep doing that, and you have to keep track of future development to not.
But if you know it's music, why would you put settings that are good for speech?
But the point is that we have right now AAC, noise suppression, gain control, for example. And so if an application that wants to be capturing music might turn those all off, which is great. And then the problem is when we add a new parameter, some other new modification, then the application somehow has to magically know that it needs to turn off this new one as well. It's just doable, but it's not great. It'd be nice for the application to say this is music, and have the browser select the appropriate things. You can have the more specific defines as well, but this would allow. The big choice here, as we said, is between putting on the sinks and also the sources for things like get user media for the microphone music thing, or whether or not it's just on the sources somehow and and then filters down through all the tracks and the like, which also means you have to be able to change it on the tracks. Like if you capture it as whatever, but the application decides it wants to, print.
But also something that's good to keep in mind is that do we really think that a user should know that our implementations can't do echo cancellation on music, and that's why they should turn it off?
I mean, if we have no use for echo cancellation, then we should remove that constraint.
I mean, I think that sometimes you want to do echo cancellation on music, right? It depends if your microphone's in the same room where you're playing it. Sometimes you don't. Like, it's an independent parameter. I agree that the default for speech is you do echo cancellation, and the default for music might be different. So this sounds nice. I get the idea, but we still need echo cancellation regardless if we have adding this.
Agreed.
Sure.
And I got cut off, but I think go ahead.
So I think one of the good things, or I think a better example is noise suppression, because you might be like, I like my music, I want it to be noise free. That's not unreasonable, and then you have to actually go into what it's doing is cutting out transients, etc. So it will mess up your snares, and I don't think a web developer should have to know that.
So if we go down this road, and particularly if we put it on, in the in the media capture spec, then I predict that we're going to actually end up needing to add another option for a variety of the parameters that can be set as constraints, and that is an auto notion, because it sort of gets at the idea of, do you want to let the browser do its best using all the information it has, which would include any content hints, or do you want to explicitly set it to some value? Because otherwise, I think it might not be clear to people that the default is varying based on something else that's been set.
Yeah. Having it available on the syncs and having it available in the tracks are not necessarily contradictory. You could have both.
What would you do if one said one and the other said another?
But the track would say it's music. You would be able to override that at the sync. But I'm not saying we should do that. I'm saying you could.
I'm not sure I like that idea, but
maybe we should first see if we can get consensus that we want this. We just don't know where it should go. Do we have consensus for that at least?
Well, I mean, I think if we're doing this, it has to go on the syncs really to make sense is the argument.
Okay, but forgetting about where it goes, can we at least like put something in the minutes?
The only thing I put so far is that we had a long discussion about this.
I'm in favor of finding some way to do this. Yeah, my only question is exactly where do the interfaces live and exactly what do they look like?
So I think we have consensus at least that the problem as stated is a real problem that we need to solve.
I think it sounds like we
agree on the hint idea. There's a hint somewhere.
So I think one of the good things to maybe agree on or not is, are we doing the right thing by letting the user specify, I have a thing, it kind of looks like this, handle it as best as you can, to make sure that it's really only the browser vendors who have to deal with this really complicated problem of what to turn on and what not to turn on?
Okay, so that part, this is why I didn't quite agree. We can't only have that. That would be absolutely miserable for applications. I'm not saying only. All I'm saying is that have a way to allow the browser to use same defaults while specifying, hey Chrome, this is detailed content, please take care of it the best you can. For people who don't know all of the constraints that they would have to touch in order to make that better. Does that make sense?
Or in case there are implementation specific knobs that aren't even exposed.
Oh yeah, say there's Goog intelligibility enhancer or whatever. That would definitely not go well on music, but it's also not in any spec. And Chrome is completely free to do that And if it assumes that everything is speech, it's going to do that for music as well.
I think the label would be Apple, not Google. They already do that. It's miserable. I don't want to be in the Apple situation where it sets things that I can't override. But yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. I get your point. I think we're going to end up with what Dan said, of an auto default added to lots of things if we go down this path. I think we just need to see what it looks like when you follow down this path. But it seems like no one's really disagreed.
So I think it's worth discussing this in more detail.
Well,
this is
we're
one.
allocating time at TPAC for that, so definitely.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's definitely worth discussing. I'll point out that one of the reasons we have constraints was that we had a similar kind of situation where browsers wanted to be able to say, I want to do something smart, and on the other hand, developers said, but I don't trust that your smarts are what I want. Right, and so it's not that there aren't smarts that the browser can use, and the example you give about, developers not knowing about new features or new features being introduced that they weren't aware were going to come up and now they have to deal with. I think we need to think it through carefully, because every time we start on the road of let's make sure the browser can do something smart, we start getting pushback from developers that say, and I want to change it.
So I think the flip side of that is this is more like let the browser use something smart. So we already are in this case where the browser can do whatever smarts it wants, but it will the strokes will be way too broad currently.
Right, you're saying the browser doesn't have the information it needs to make that smart decision. Right.
Right. And I guess if you want to have some mode where you're like, no processing whatsoever, please, then I don't think that's mutually exclusive to this proposal. But this, a good thing to really keep in mind is that this proposal means that it would be good to have auto settings basically everywhere. Or for some notion of everywhere, maybe this would not tie directly into bitrate allocation. Or maybe it would, because maybe you prefer detailed content over motion content while allocating bit rates. I don't know. So that it's good to keep in mind where or how broadly this stretches into other things.
But Dan, thinking about constraints, I mean, one use case was also that two tabs could apply different constraints, but if they were compatible, both tabs could kind of consume the track the way they wanted. In this case, would it be reasonable for one tab to interpret an audio like speech and the other one, another tab interpreting as music?
That's why I think this is going to require some more discussion and careful thought, because once you get to the point of saying, okay, now we do need auto as an option, I was thinking, how are we going to work that into the already complex select settings algorithm? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but figuring out exactly what that means, and specifically in the case of track interactions with the same source, like you just described, we just need to think it through. It's not that we can't do it, but it's not. I think there are probably broader ramifications than have come up so far.
One other good thing to keep in mind is whether or not these settings should backpropagate. So if you have an RTP receiver and you say, actually this is music, should that turn off the WebRTC, whatever it's called, where it fills packets and does packet smearing and resampling, etc. Should you be able to, or if you clone a track and then you set the hint property on one of its children, will that influence the default on the parent? Probably not, but these are hairy things.
Yeah. And that's part of why I'm tending to lean towards setting this on sources and sinks, not on tracks, because it gets kind of confusing what happens when you start having different requirements for different pieces. When you put on the sources, the sinks and the sources, it's much more clear what you're doing.
So I think one
we don't have sources at the moment. We have the handleable object of tracks, and we do everything we do to a source, we do to the track.
Well, I mean by source, I mean the get user media where you apply the things like AAC constraints.
Yeah, that produces the track.
Right, but the point is it's not. But it's not a property of the track that is changeable by messing with the well. My point was that when you did get user media, you could say this is music, or apply constraints or whatever.
So whether it's music or not can also definitely change over time, depending on how you want to do it. So if I'm doing like a live recording where I'm talking to the audience, that might be speech, and then I bring up my guitar and it's no longer speech. Also a good point is whether or not we care about that, like whether anyone will actually use it in practice enough to warrant the spec change.
Yeah,
I think one of the things,
I'd be iffy on that.
Yeah, the strongest thing that I had for putting it on the track, I think, is not having to change every single spec that can use it. So if there's another way to say, like, any consumer should have this kind of property on it, or have a common property that you can refer to from other specs, and then only have to change this sync property. So if you have a content hint object, and then RTP sender could refer to that spec that defines it, as well as how you open the camera could also refer to the same spec entry, just so we don't end up in a case where we have 8 different implementations of the content hint that are all out of date. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's more of a process issue, and I'll leave that to people who understand the process part of it and how all the specs interact better.
The nice thing about this one is that we actually have a proposed spec that has an implementation, so people can play with it and see how they like it and find out what they think is a problem.
Oh wait, yeah. So context for this is already implemented under the Blink experimental flag in Chrome. So if you want to try it out, there's also a demo page. It does not expose anything that Chrome could do, of course, because we could be a lot more aggressive in terms of, we could quantize video a lot more to prioritize high motion video, but we don't. So if you want to play it out or play with it, there is a CR bug that I can link that in the issue, I guess, or have that sent out with notes. I don't know who to give that link to. It might be good.
Yeah, could you paste it into the IRC link? Yeah, someone did, I guess.
Peter, I have a question.
Yep.
Have you given any thought to how this would impact other downstream specs? I mean, you mentioned that at the beginning, but I'm thinking, we have people who have extended the media capture and stream spec to provide depth, or other capabilities. And I'm just wondering if you also, in your implementation, thought about how those might be impacted by this new addition to the core spec.
So what I did, so no, I have not. And the only thing I've done for the implementation, to be honest, is just flip the screen share bit based on however you decide to override it. It's really just a minimal what we have for video right now. But one thing that I did was I designed the enum to kind of be so that you can extend it with additional values without breaking existing implementations. So any unknown value will be a no-op. So if you want to add some depth specific thing because you start to have depth capture, then that would not be in conflict with implementations that do not support it. They would just ignore that value. So you could then set, sorry, this might be on a tangent, but what you'd have is if you set motion first and then set like depth capture motion, then depth capture motion would just not be set and you'd still keep the motion one. So you'd be able to have increasingly specific hints if you go down this road. I think that might more be a bike shedding thing. Maybe that answers your question in how little I have actually thought into it.
Well, I'm not so much concerned about extension specs being able to also extend this. I presume that you would allow for those kinds of extensions. It was more just, when we originally created the media capture spec, we were thinking of its use primarily for WebRTC, but of course other groups use it and they use it for other purposes. So more and more we have to think, anything that we add into that spec, we have to be aware of how that addition might impact other specs that have extended it. So that was all. That was just a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I've not looked at extensions to the capture spec. I was just thinking that this could influence Media Stream Recorder as well, and in that case, it would be a good influence.
Okay. So I'd like to suggest that we talk a little bit about next steps. We will have time allocated at TPAC. Do we have a goal at TPAC, like to have a more detailed proposal for a lot of the things we talked about today? And for example, Dan, can you work with Peter to kind of try to flesh some of that out?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And in fact, if we have time for any of the people doing extensions to join us, I don't actually know if that's in the agenda yet or not, like depth, if they wanted to come in and talk, that this might be a great time to have them join is during this discussion.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we can think about that, Stefan, in terms of the agenda.
Yeah.
How to organize it.
Yeah, I think maybe we will have some depth guys coming. They haven't really confirmed, but they indicated we could join.
One of the requests that one of our groups had to me long ago that I'd sort of ignored, but fits into this well, is for speech. The difference between near field and far field speech, how you process it is very different, and often from the application type of microphone, you know which it is. If there was a way to extend that type of information into here, I'd be really interested in seeing if we can meet those goals as well.
So yeah, I can see the number of categories exploding here pretty fast. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, definitely. So what I really started with the video use case, and I'm less familiar with the speech and music thing. I just know that there are some things that we do that are wrong for music. So I'd be happy to consider other values as well. I mostly I wanted this to be handed over to a working group rather than being my baby extension spec that no one will touch. Right. So if extending speech to near field and far field is meaningfully useful and also understandable, that sounds like a good thing. If that means that you can influence the implementation to do work a lot better.
Right. Okay.
All right. So we do have two issues left. Jan Ivar was supposed to present them, but he's not here. So I'm wondering who's going to talk about them. Who feels qualified? Is there anyone?
So I'm willing to talk about them. I took a look at them, Bernard.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dan.
And I actually changed the order of the two of them because I think this one we can do pretty quickly. The other one may require some more work.
Okay. Go ahead.
So what I'm going to do is try to explain the concern that Jan Ivar had, and then I'll give my opinions, and then we can, go into discussion from there. So the question is, does get settings reflect configured or actual settings? I think probably one of the best example is that, or the best comments is live measured values sometimes deviate from their target settings. So for example, if you have a camera motor that, a camera is panning and it's going from 30 to 60, the actual value may not be the same as the setting value or the target setting value for quite a while. In a system overload case or low light case, your frame rate may fluctuate, and it may actually be different from the target that was set. So then the question, get settings returning the actual values, or is it returning sort of the configured values? And So I'll tell you from my perspective, this question has come up before. We have discussed this specific topic, and Cullen gave the example of the camera pan, probably 3-4 years ago. And at that time, the conclusion was that the only thing that made sense for us was to use the target value rather than the actual setting value. That was the only kind of sane response. If anyone else has something else that they'd like to propose or something else they'd like to bring up in this context, please do. I will say that the next to last bullet on this slide about aggressive over-constrained error or on over-constrained, I'm not sure exactly what Janavar had in mind here. So if anyone would care to comment on that as well, feel free to.
I think I can comment on this. I mean, basically, Janavar has always totally hated mandatory constraints and is trying to eliminate them. So the one he's standing on right now is frame rates. And, my position is if your application sets a minimum frame rate of, 29.5 frames per second, and it drops down to 20 frames per second because of low lighting in the camera, Janavar does not think we should get an error. He thinks it's better just to carry on. I think you should get an error because that's why you set the constraint was as a mandatory constraint, so you'd get an error. We both agree you should try and get 30 frames per second if you get on that. That's what I think the mandatory constraints do. On the pan thing, though, I agree. What I think we're doing is the definition of the value is the desired pan position of the camera. If we did something like that, it wouldn't be the actual position. There would be no value for the actual position. But on the frame rate, I think we're setting the frame rate.
Isn't there a problem with the way that we're naming things if it's impossible to tell what you get from the API call just by looking at the API call?
Well, I mean, we don't have a pan, right? But if we did, it would be main.
No, but I just mean get settings.
Well, okay. I think get settings should return you the current setting. And I think if the setting is right. Sorry, let me rephrase your question. What do you want to ask?
So if you have users looking at your API call being get settings and they can't say whether it's the settings that you set or whether it's the settings that are in place in the actual physical object, should you name it get configured settings or something just to avoid the confusion?
Or should it return a mixture of whatever pan position, whatever, and
like
current,
and
have some way to such that if there is a separate current value thing that's available as something that is returned to query, but you can't set the current value. You can only set the desired value.
Right. So the original intent of this, when it was created, was, we were looking at height and width, for example, on video, and you might set max and min constraints on those, and then within the max and min, the browser would set some value. Okay, and it might change that value over time as other tracks provide additional constraints that are compatible. And so you would want to see what did it actually end up getting set to. So I think this is kind of Cullen's point, is that your setting in the case of a camera is the desired location, not where it currently is as it's trying to get to the desired location. And that is really, conceptually, it's different from this case of the browser has said, no, I'm going to use this width and this height. So I think the comparable items are the desired location for the camera and the actual width and height, right, as opposed to where the motor is currently. Now, with frame rate, well, that's an interesting one. I would tend to say that the setting, the current setting, is what it is configured to be, meaning that maybe you have two different tracks and one has required an exact frame rate of a certain value and another has required an exact frame rate of a completely different value. Actually, that's probably not right. Let me give ranges, right? So again, you have two compatible ranges, and there's one frame rate that is the target frame rate that the browser has picked, that is supposed to satisfy both of those constraints. That's great. We understand that the actual frame rate may vary. So in the case of frame rate, we may actually have to put some additional description about how much variation is allowed due to sort of, the fact that frame rate is not an exact, may not be an exact thing.
Now, one thing this all points out that the confusion over settings versus measurements, or settings versus current state, is just biting us again and again here. It would be nice to cleanly separate the two, okay? And then reasoning about this and dealing with it by applications becomes a lot more straightforward. Now, that may be a rather large change at this point, but...
Yeah, with minus 1 minute left in this call, that's a great point. But actually, that might be a good discussion topic, actually, at TPAC, is whether we have really crossed the threshold that we have to add something big new to the spec, and that is to be able to get the actual values, as opposed to doing JS measurement as, measuring, as Janavar suggests.
I don't think we have many cases driving that yet. Right. Yeah. We don't have pan tilt.
So I need to drop off now, so someone else would have to conclude.
We need to end the call, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
we know we have more discussion to do here.
Yep.
And remember
Good
that
thing we started with the simple one. Yep.
Remember that we have a deploy base to cater to.
Yes. I am always aware of that. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.
everybody.
All right, thanks.
Think about it.
Bye.